Paris, August 1867. They say that some cantatrices can break a glass by singing. But on that particular day, it was woodworkers who used their axes to break down the astonishing wood and glass scaffolding that hid from curious bystanders the facade of a building that was to be opened with great pomp and ceremony. It was the new Paris Opera, known to all as the Opéra Garnier, named for its architect, Charles Garnier. The story of the Palais Garnier began here in the Rue Le Pelletier in January 1858 with an explosion. That evening, Napoleon III attended the opera in the old theater that had been open in the Rue Le Pelletier since 1821. A bomb thrown by the Italian revolutionary Orsini missed the emperor, but convinced him to start building a new opera house that he could attend in safety. In fact, they had been talking for some 20 years about replacing the old, provisional, and inconvenient opera house with a building to give Paris a theater worthy of its name. In 1860, the project was declared to be for the public benefit. It gave rise to such passionate arguments that instead of designating the architect itself as was customary, the imperial administration decided to hold a competition, the very first of its kind. 171 architects took part. Entries were made anonymously, identified by numbers and slogans. Number 17, Art elevates the soul. Number 50, Paris, capital of art and pleasure. It was project number 38, I aspire to much, I expect but little, that won the competition for the largest and most prestigious public building of France's Second Empire. Its creator was unknown. At 34 years old, Garnier had never built anything other than an apartment house on the Boulevard de Sébastopol. He had no office and had to build one quickly on the site, where he assembled a team of young architects who, like himself, were former pupils of the École des Beaux-Arts, a group imbued with the school spirit and ties of friendship. The project was huge, very expensive, and politically sensitive. The architect would have to work under the close supervision of the emperor and his ministers, the prefect Haussmann, who was busy remodeling Paris, the parliamentary opposition, and public opinion. The site was constantly visited, commented on, and criticized. Above all, pressure was put on Garnier to finish as soon as possible, because they all wanted to have something to inaugurate for the 1867 World's Fair. They made it, but only the facade. Nothing inside had been completed. However, the outside of the building is so striking that it showed clearly what the architect had in mind. A monumental building whose facade closes the perspective of a ceremonial avenue that was driven through the city to reach the Louvre and the Tuileries, the imperial residence. It was the only one of Haussmann's avenues without any functional purpose, created solely to serve and enhance a monument, simply cutting through the city, rather like, said Garnier, blowing a trumpet in a sick room. the theatrical effect of the facade in the perspective of the avenue is misleading. In fact, the monument is smothered by the city surrounding it and prevents us from appreciating its real proportions. It is both wider than the avenue allows us to see and much longer, 157 meters. The plot was imposed on Garnier by Prefect Haussmann. The diamond shape, formed by the new roads planned around it and the dictates of traffic flow, is completely unsuited for such a key building. Garnier tried in vain to have it changed. The prefect considered that the roads were much more important. Trying to make the best of this difficult site, Garnier had the idea of creating 2 side pavilions. One to be the private entrance as expressly specified for the season ticket holders, about 200 people who were wealthy enough to take a box for the whole year. And the other for the emperor, for whom the entrance was up an imposing ramp worthy of the entrance to a chateau. This is the only exception to the total symmetry of the building. Garnier was much criticized by an architectural review of the period for sacrificing the law of parallelism to courtly flattery. It also expressed astonishment in the same article at the abundance of imperial eagles. The opera is stuffed into a hole, hidden in the depths and buried in a quarry. I console myself with the thought that in a few hundred years Paris will have a prefect who will decide to free the opera by razing the whole district to the ground. But if old buildings were to be pulled down, it was to build new ones in their place. Here, once again, the monument caused conflict between the city and its prefect, because, to the great surprise of the architect, Haussmann allowed these new buildings to be built more than 5 meters higher than the regulation limit. Garnier had to change his plans in a hurry to raise the attic overhanging the colonnade in order to combat the giant neighbors. Otherwise, he said, the monument will no longer be a theater, but just the building opposite. This battle of the heights was only fought for the facade. Where the rest of the building was concerned, Garnier feared no man. The other great singularity of the opera is the strange way in which it towers above the city. Apollo's lyre, which is also a lightning conductor, is 56 meters above the ground. These great disproportionate clashing volumes, this slightly flattened dome that supports a cyclopean gable, create strong plastic effects that upset the classic taste. But, contrary to appearance, Garnier considered this to be a rational approach. The outer shape of the edifice is intended to express the spaces inside and their functions. According to Garnier, one ought to be able to understand the building simply by following the line of the roofs. The structure was designed as a succession of clearly separated segments, each housing a particular part of the plan. The first segment is reserved for access and the public areas. The second is the auditorium. The third is the stage. And the fourth is for the various technical and administrative services. The 2 volumes dominating the whole are the auditorium and the stage. According to Garnier, the dome expresses the circular shape of the auditorium with its horseshoe layout that can house 2,000 spectators. Here, the architect tried to show a little restraint. He said that the auditorium should be discreet in its appearance. It should harmonize with the stage without attempting to overshadow it. Carefully concealed behind the moldings and gilding is a metallic structure that shapes the flooring and framework of the auditorium and reduces the risk of fire, something dreaded in all previous grand theaters. Garnier mastered the techniques of metallic construction, but unlike Baltard and Labrouste, he remained totally insensitive to the aesthetics of ironwork, and throughout his career he always refused to let it show. As to the subject dear to all music lovers, the acoustics, Garnier dealt with that in his own way. I studied the question for a long time, and I discovered this. To ensure good sound in an auditorium, some people say it should be made of wood or stone, others that you have to plant trees or make it entirely out of glass, or that the walls should be clad in imitation snow, or that one should follow the advice of Vitruvius and put saucepans under the banquettes. The architect's conclusion was that the best thing to ensure good acoustics was to do nothing at all but leave it to chance. And it worked, very well indeed, if we are to judge by the effect of the strength of the voice on the great chandelier. Although the auditorium was considered rather small by the standards of the time, the stage, which was designed to display the huge sets for grand opera that was so popular in the middle of the 19th century, is one of the largest in Europe. The main, according to Garnier, the only quality of the stage was in being vast in every sense of the word. But the volume is particularly striking by its height and depth. The foundations are far deeper than for other buildings. In fact, Garnier arranged an understage space of 5 storage, which meant that a 15-meter-high set could be lowered in one piece without breaking it up, thanks to the impressive machinery made up of windlasses and ropes. It was like being on a sailing ship, and so it was. Stagehands at the time were mostly former ship's carpenters. While digging the foundations for this space, Garnier came upon a subterranean water table. To prevent infiltration, he had to construct a concrete reservoir under the foundations that he filled with water to counterbalance the external pressure. This reservoir, that now serves as a water supply for firemen, is the origin of the legend about an underground lake beneath the opera. With a fly tower 20 meters above the stage, the whole area looks like a huge factory, covered by a pitched roof and metallic frame that dominates both the building and the city. As to the technical and administrative buildings, set properly at one end of the plot, Garnier treated them with a strictness that was for once completely classic, in contrast to the exuberant principal facade. The building looks like nothing else known in the Parisian landscape. Yet Garnier knew his classics and didn't hesitate to take inspiration from them. The monumental colonnade of the principal facade that designates the main floor and dominates the composition is a direct reference to the colonnade of the Louvre. But at the same time, Garnier tempered the monumentality by creating a secondary plan. The great columns are backed up by smaller columns and surmounted by a stone screen that the architect compared to a curtain, closing the portico and giving the building a lived-in look. There are contrasts of scale and also of materials and color. Opposing the great white Bavarian stone columns are the smaller columns in tea-rose-colored marble with gilded capitals, whose refinement is intended to show that they are just adornment and not part of the structure of the facade. Garnier was a convinced partisan of polychromy, considered as a heresy in a traditionally monochrome Parisian setting. He was accused of daubing his monument. But in his opinion, rational polychromy tended to clarify the composition and even to affirm the purpose of the building. In September 1870, imperial rule came to an end. On its last legs, the regime had tried to regain its laurels by going to war with Prussia. That was a disaster. The empire collapsed and a republic was proclaimed. Napoleon III fled and Paris was besieged. The opera, which had only a few workers left with one of Garnier's assistants, was converted into a food store by the army with stocks of salt beef, oats, and wine. Hardly a year earlier, the Parisians were up in arms about the group sculpture in the facade, Carpeau's Dance. One middle-class citizen was so maddened by its lack of modesty that he threw a bottle of ink at it. Now people came to read the proclamations by the Paris Commune posted on the railings. The building had come to be the symbol of the hated regime and seemed destined to remain unfinished. Five years later, there was a new coup de théâtre. They began the final work before the opening in a great hurry, as usual. In 1873, the old opera in the Rue Le Pelletier, still being used, burned down, and Garnier was told to finish the work he had started as quickly as possible. It took 2 years of intense activity to finish the whole of the interior fittings, and finally, in 1875, the building was ready to be inaugurated for the second time. Despite the catastrophe of the war and the corpses of the Commune, the Third Republic took up the splendors of the Second Empire. The program for the opening night featured nothing but extracts for fear of upsetting anybody. But they forgot to invite the architect, who was obliged to pay for his own box. However, that evening nobody came for the music. They were there for the architecture, to see just what Garnier had been up to 15 years after work started. While the auditorium and the stage were classic, the first segment, giving the audience access to the building and for them to wander through during intervals, was a complete innovation. Access areas had always been the architectural Cinderella in theaters, treated as simple utilitarian necessities. Garnier gave them an importance that had never before been seen. Nearly a quarter of the building was devoted to them. The spectators entered by a fairly low first vestibule. On the first floor, the architect had set the ceremonial areas reserved for the interval. The main room is the grand foyer, with its large windows onto the balcony and the avenue, which is a direct reference to the Galerie des Glaces at Versailles. But this luxury was merely a foretaste of what was to come. The architect's masterpiece, the great staircase. As always with Garnier, the interplay between materials and curves also correspond to practical considerations. The monumental staircase that sweeps up before the spectators opens from the low vestibule, clearly indicating the path to follow, while its structure makes it possible to divide the flow according to the seats they will occupy in the auditorium. The two side wings lead to the first boxes. The central part takes one straight to the orchestra stalls. But the staircase is only part of a much larger whole, a stairwell, a great empty space that Garnier compared to the facade of a building, but which also evokes the interior courtyard of a palace, and especially the halls of the great shops and hotel built at that time on the same principle of open galleries around an empty space. Here it is the space itself, enlivened by the flow of people that is the object of display, and which can be admired from the onyx balconies set out like boxes. The architecture sets the scene, and the architect can dream of directing the show. Ah, if I could direct an opera just for one day, I would use all the marvelous operatic costumes to fill the staircase. But I'm just a simple architect and must be content to dream. It was only in 1926 that the cinema made the architect's dream come true, in an adaptation of Gaston Leroux's famous novel, The Phantom of the Opera, reinterpreting Garnier's architecture in its own way and frightening the dancers. But some of the secrets of the house are rather more sordid. The foyer de la danse was a curtained-off area at the back of the stage which was supposed to be for the dancers to exercise in. Garnier set it at the back of the stage so that it could also serve as an extension for scenes that required particular depth. But in reality, this rehearsal area, accessible to season ticket holders only, was used for another purpose. Here they came to choose their dancers, in a brothel-like decor that seemed for once to have totally escaped the control of the architect. A decor with its false air of innocence that made it even more oppressive. The double arch of the ceiling hides a secret gallery for voyeurs. And these windows open straight onto blank walls. It was not until 1935 that this moral mix was ended. The season ticket holders were forbidden the foyer de la danse, which became once more a simple rehearsal area, just like the others, except that when the curtain is pulled back, the large mirror reflects a telescopic view of the wings, the stage, and the auditorium, the theatrical illusion in all its glory. The curtain falls as it has every evening since 1875. But one show is hardly over before another takes its place, the architecture. A show with its excesses and its splendor, and above all its riot of decorative detail that makes it hard to believe that this is the work of just one man, even if he did have 15 years to think about it. It is just an impression, but the abundance of impressions created by the lyric drama had to be completed by the impression of abundance that is created by the architecture. That is doubtless the strongest intuition of this architect who was such a lover of the theater. He used excess and profusion to create a constantly renewed series of sensations, doing with building and space what the theater does with time, capturing through architecture that ever-fugitive quality that is the nature of the ephemeral live performance.